Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Gimel. We are going to continue discussing cases where the rabbis were lenient regarding Demai, because as an introduction, we said previously, Tevel is produce that you do not remove the proper Tumot and Maasrot. Now, that cannot be eaten. If produce does not have Maaser and Truma removed from it, it's a biblical prohibition to eat it, and one who does is subject to death by the hands of heaven. In addition to that, other forms of benefit from Tevel, like planting or any benefit that results in Tevel being used up, like feeding it to animals or using it as light for a oil candle, that's also a so. You're not allowed to have any pleasure in the Tevel as well. However, there's a difference. The Mifashim do explain that only when you eat are you liable for death at the hands of heaven, but the other prohibitions are not subject to any penalty. Now, as far as Demai is concerned, because the Chachamim said most Amei Aretz do separate, and we're just out of concern for the severity, we're strict, the Chachamim were lenient regarding having other various types of pleasure as long as it was bought for anything other than eating. Because, like we said, when it's not eating the tevel, rather it's other benefits, the severity is less. So by Demai, for sure, Chachamim were lenient. Now the Mishnah is going to list several examples. Halokech lezera, a person who buys produce from an amaretz for planting, v'labehema, or for feeding his animals. Kemach leorot, he bought flour for processing animal hides into leather. Shemen laner, he bought oil for lighting a lamp. Shemen lasuch bo et hakelim, or he bought oil for greasing utensils. Patur min Demai, they are exempt from Demai obligation, because again, the Demai obligation only applies to food that was bought for the purpose of being eaten by people, or in the case of oil, smearing it on your body, because the Mifashim explain that when you smear oil on your body, it's like drinking. Now the Rab does point out, just important to know, he says, if you bought it originally, the produce, let's say the whatever you bought from the amaretz, you bought it to feed your animal, then it's exempt from Demai. However, if you bought it for your own consumption, afterwards you changed your mind, you want to feed it to your animal, then it remains obligated in removing the Maaser because of the concern of Demai. It was only when you bought it originally to feed your animals do the Chachamim give this exemption. Now, Rabotai, we know that the entire mitzvah of separating the Tumot and Maasrot only apply in the biblical boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss a northern part of Eretz Yisrael regarding the laws of Demai. Mikiziv ulehalan, produce that was purchased from the town of Kiziv and beyond and above. Patur mina Demai, it's exempt from the Demai obligation, because the Mifashim, we're going to explain, that area was not sanctified from Kiziv and up when the Jews returned from the Galut Bavel, the Babylonian exile. The borders of Eretz Yisrael were established twice. Once by Oleh Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt and we conquered land in Israel, and the second time after the 70 years of the exile of Babylon. Now the Rab explains, Kiziv usofa makom shekavshu Oleh Babel. Kiziv was the end where the Oleh Babel, after the exile, when they returned, that was where they conquered up until. Umisham ulealan kavshu Oleh Mitzrayim. From Kiziv and northward, that was already what the people that came out of Mitzrayim conquered. V'lo kavshu Oleh Babel, but the Oleh Babel, the people that came up from Babylon exile, didn't go above. V'lo nitchayvu b'Demai ela haratzot shekavshu Oleh Babel bilvad. And the Rab tells us that the Chachamim only made the prohibition of Demai take effect by the boundaries that were set by the Oleh Babel, the people that came out of the Babylonian exile. Hilkach, therefore, mikiziv ulealan patur min Demai, from Kiziv and above, you're exempt from Demai, because the Oleh Babel, the people that came from Babylon, did not go past that area. V'lo cheshinan shema miperot haaretz shekapshu Oleh Babel holichu lisham. And the Rab writes, we have no concern that maybe from Jerusalem fruits were taken to above Kiziv. So it is chayav shechazkat chutz haaretz patur, because the status quo outside of the land of Israel is that it's exempt. Ad shiodeh lecha shu chayav, until it's made known to you otherwise. V'chizkat Eretz Yisrael chayav, and likewise produce in the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael are always assumed to be from there. Ad shiodeh lech shu patur, unless it is informed to you that it is exempt. So the Mishnah tells us from Kiziv and upward, from any portion that the Oleh Bavel did not conquer, even though Oleh Mitzrayim conquered it, it's exempt from Demai. The Chachamim were lenient. They did not require you to have to separate Tumot and Maasrot from the produce that was purchased from an Amaretz in that area. Now the Mishnah is going to exclude also other types of sanctified foods from Demai, since Amei Aratzot were trusted generally to separate Ma'asrot from those foods. The Mishnah says Chalat Amaretz, the Chalav Amaretz, V'amduma. Amduma is a mixture of teruma and churin, unsanctified produce, that got combined together. The Mefarshim explain just as where the word comes from. They say it comes from the lashon of dema. Dema is a kinui. It's a nickname, so to speak, given to the produce of teruma. It's called dema. So we say hamduma is a mixture of truma, sanctified food, and churin. If you buy that from Nama'aretz, you don't have to be concerned of Ma'asrot. V'alakuach bekesef Ma'aser Sheni, food that was purchased from Nama'aretz with money of Ma'aser Sheni. Usherei menachot, the remaining part of the mincha offering of an Nama'aretz. Piturin min Demai. All these cases, they are exempt from the obligation of Demai. Since they are sanctified foods, the Nama'aretz is careful to tithe it. Now let us explain the case by case. Chalat Nama'aretz is like this. We know that the Torah tells us in Sefer Bamidbar, there's a requirement when you need dough for baking bread or similar. The Torah requires that a portion of it, known as what we call challah, be separated and given to the Kohen. The Mishnah is telling us that when a Kohen receives from an Ama'aretz challah, he does not have to remove the Turumot and Ma'asrot, because the Chachamim say since Ama'aretz treats these sanctified foods with awe and respect, most probably we assume that they were strict by Ma'asel to make sure it was removed. Therefore, we can rely that it was tithed. Obviously, the Mishnah and the Mefarshim explain, or speaking about a case where we know the dough was needed by somebody who's trusted to make sure it doesn't become impure. Otherwise, if it's a standard Ama'aretz, then we're going to assume that the dough is impure. In any event, it cannot be eaten by the Kohen, has to be eaten in purity. But as long as we know that he took care of it in purity, we can trust that he removed the Ma'asrot and the Kohen would be allowed to eat it. Likewise, same thing by Miduma. When you have a mixture of Teruma and Churin of Nama'aretz, obviously the only person that can eat it in such a case is the Kohen, unless you have 1/100th more than the Teruma. You have more, 1/100th, you have more Churin than Teruma. In that case, the Teruma is to be less than 1/100th. If it's less than 1/100th of the Churin, anyone can eat it. But if it's 1/100th and more in the chunin, then only a Kohen can eat it. So if you buy this produce from an Amaretz, this mixture, since the owner's not allowed to eat it, he gives it to the Kohen. We assume that the Amaretz, even though normally we suspect him of not having separated, since the Amaretz knows that it's being given to a Kohen, it has to be in impurity, again, we trust that he has separated the Ma'asrot properly. V'alakuach bekesef Ma'aser Sheni, we said, was food that you purchased from Ama'aretz with money of Ma'aser Sheni. The Rav explains the case that Sherakach Demai b'me'od shel Ma'aser Sheni. You went to an Ama'aretz and you took Ma'aser Sheni money, which we explained previously. The farmer grew produce in the land of Israel. On the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th year, he must take that produce and eat it 10% and eat it in Yerushalayim. If he cannot do that, he transfers the sanctity of that 10% onto coins. If he'd use these coins to buy produce from an Amaretz in Yerushalayim, which is usually suspected of not being tithed, he's allowed to eat it. Ben b'me'ot b'ma'aser sheni shel demai, ben b'me'ot b'ma'aser sheni shel vadai. In any case, whichever ma'aser sheni it came from, whether it came from demai or regular, patur min ha'aser, you do not have to separate it. Obviously, again, the Mishnah, the Mefarshim point out to Osfin to writes, the Mishnah is talking about a case where the buyer told the Amaretz beforehand that he's buying the produce with Ma'aser Sheni money. Because now, since the Amaretz knows that Ma'aser Sheni produce becomes holy, he's careful to tithe it before he sells it. If you didn't tell him, then it's like buying regular food from him, then we would have the concern. Usherei menachot, the remaining part of the Korban Mincha, we know the Torah explains to us that you have the Korban Mincha is made out of flour and oil. Now, what we have is that the Kohen would scoop out a part, it's called kmitzah, and he would burn down on the Mizbeach. He would separate a kmitzah from the mincha offering, burn it on the Mizbeach. The rest was allowed to be eaten by the Kohanim in the Temple Mount courtyard. Now, the Mishnah is teaching us, if an Ama'aretz brings a Korban Mincha in the Beit HaMikdash, we're not concerned that he didn't tithe it. We can be lenient and somech that he tithed it, and the Kohanim are allowed to eat that portion in the courtyard without having tithed it. Now, the Mishnah discusses a previous machlok we had earlier. Shemen Arev. Let's say you have a fragrant oil, which the Mefarshim explains, Shemen Afar Simon, balsam oil. Some explain shemen zayit, the Rav says, me'urav in mor, va'olot, upsamim, mixed in with other spices. Shemen arev, so you have a fragrant oil. You bought it from an Amaretz for its pleasant aroma. You didn't buy it to use on your body like a perfume. You just bought it to smell. Bet Shammai mechayvin. Bet Shammai say, nevertheless, you must remove the maasrot. We treat it as demai, or Bet Hillel potrin, but Bet Hillel ruled that it's exempt from the laws of demai. And the Mefarshim explain, Bet Hillel accepts the Mishnah's first ruling that since the oil was never intended for eating, only for smearing on the body, it was not intended for eating or smearing on the body, rather was only intended for its fragrance. It's not part of the laws of Demai. Obviously, if he ate it, it would be Demai. And also, if he smeared on his body, we said it's like drinking, it would be Demai, obligated in Maasrot. But since here he only bought it to smell, it's not bought as food or smearing on his body, it's exempt. Bet Shammai, however, say that the decree of Demai also includes food that were not bought for eating or smearing on the body. They disagree with that first part of the Mishnah that we said. That is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Gimel. Now the Mishnah is going to, in Mishnah Daled, continue discussing other cases where we were lenient by the laws of Demai. Now, Rabotai, just to understand this Mishnah, we have to make ourselves familiar with two concepts, all in the same realm of Chatzerot, what we know as, outside, do we have an Eruv Chatzerot, and Eruv Techumin, different types of Eruvim. Now, the Mishnah is going to speak regarding two different Drabanans, enactments named by the rabbis, both referred to the topic of Eruv. Number one, you have what we call Eruv Techumin. Now, we know that on Shabbat, a person is not allowed to walk 2,000 amot past wherever his residence began on Shabbat. He cannot walk past, it's called going past the Tchum, the border. You have 2,000 amot past your legal boundary when Shabbat began. What the Chachamim allow you to do is what we have Eruv Tchumin. We allow you to reach a place that's more than 2,000 from your actual residence. How? Within the 2,000 of your residence, you put food. It shifts your place of residence to where the food is and allows you to walk 2,000 amot past the food, because now it's considered like I live where the food is. The second enactment of Eruvei Chatzerot, right now we spoke about Eruvei Techumin, the Eruv of the borders, that if you can put the food within the 2,000, it extends by another 2,000. Now we're going to describe Eruvei Chatzerot, which is like this. Basically, the Chachamim prohibited carrying between one of the houses in an enclosed courtyard and the courtyard itself. You have a courtyard, you have a house, they don't want you to carry in the courtyard itself. What we do is we have Eruvei Chatzerot. You have all the residents come out on Erev Shabbat, they place bread into one house, creating a single residence for all the residents of the courtyard. Now it would be allowed to go out into that courtyard. Just to make it a little clearer, I wanted to read to you in the commentaries how they describe this Gzerat Rabbanan, this Takanat the Chachamim made, Eruvei Chatzerot. Midin Torah, biblically, Chatzer mukefet mechitzot mekol uchotea. If you have a wall that is enclosed from all of its sides, it's shared. You have one wall that's shared, let's say, by 3, 4, 5 houses, and all the houses enter into the same courtyard that's surrounded by walls. The Torah considers it a private property, and you ought to carry from the houses into this courtyard that it goes into. However, Chachamim, primarily Shlomo HaMelech and his Beddin, they prohibited carrying from the courtyard into the houses and vice versa, until you do what we call Eruvei Chatzerot, as a as like a protection for the Isur of carrying from private to public, because Chachamim say that this courtyard that the house is open into, it looks a little bit like public property. People might get confused. So what do? You take, again, like we said, everyone who lives in this common courtyard takes bread and they put it in one of the houses, and now it comes out that they're all legal owners, they're all legally share one residence. Now it's as if they all live in the same house that's in the chatzer, and now it's all considered like one property as opposed to 5 different houses opening in the same courtyard. So the Mishnah now is going to discuss these two requirements by the rabbis have food in them, right? Eruvei Techumin, how do you extend your 2,000 amot? By putting food. How do you allow 5 houses that open up into one courtyard to be able to carry in and out, vice versa? By putting bread. So the Mishnah is going to explain to us now if you're allowed to use the Demai as the bread or not. Ha-Demai me'arvin bo u'mishtatefin bo. Demai, you're allowed to make an eruv with it. You're allowed to make shutfei mevo'ot with it to allow the courtyard to be used. Another example we have to give, Rabotai, is what the Mishnah says, Mishtatefin bo, Shutfei Mevo'ot, is another decree the Chachamim made. It's similar to the Eruvei Chatzirot, like we said. However, it differs in a certain aspect. I'm going to read it to you inside. Just like the sages do not allow you to carry from the 5 houses that are in the same courtyard, because again it resembles a little bit like public property. Likewise, they prohibited carrying from courtyards into an alleyway that open into each other. Even though the alleyway is considered a private property, it's blocked out. But again, since in comparison to the courtyards, it looks like it's going into a public domain, the Gemara in Eruvin explains it more. In order to make it less similar to it, Chachamim made what we call shituf mevoot, that again, you put food in one of the courtyards or in all the houses. Everyone who has access to this alleyway contributes to food. Therefore, what we make it, like the alleyway is connected with all the courtyards as one private property. So the Mishnah says, Hademai me'arvin bo, you can do both eruvin with it. Mishtatefin bo, you can make this connection with the alleyway with it. Umivachin alav, you're allowed to make bracha on it, meaning the Mefarshim do explain that even though you're not allowed to make the blessing beforehand, since you know you're not allowed to eat it, we are talking about after the fact. A person violated and he ate Demai bread, he recites Birkat Hamazon after his meal because the Chachamim treat it leniently. However, generally, you cannot make a blessing on forbidden foods before or after. But again, since Demai, Chachamim say most Ameratzot do separate and it's just a concern, we make you recite the Birkat Hamazon. Umizamnin alav, again, like we learned in Mesechet Brachot Mishnayot, that somebody who ate Demai, we can count him in the Zimun. Generally, we know, we learned earlier, when 3 or more men eat together, they are obligated in a joint blessing of Zimun to bless Hashem together. However, it's only when you eat permitted food. If one of the people ate prohibited food, you cannot join in the Zimun. How are you going to bless God for eating pork, for eating something asur? But since on a certain level, Demai is viewed as permitted food, why? Because the Rav tells us a very interesting logic. Demai is allowed to be eaten by any poor person, right? Any poor person is allowed to eat Demai. What can you do? A person can technically make all of his property ownerless, causing himself to be poor and to be allowed to eat the Demai. So since he has this possibility, we call him halacha migu. Since he can make all his property ownerless, effectively making him poor, and he would be allowed to eat the Demai, it's permitted on a certain level. Therefore, he'd be allowed to be included in the Zimun, and he would also be obligated in reciting Birkat Hamazon on it. The Mishnah continues, Umafrishin oto arom, you're allowed to tithe Demai even when you're unclothed, since there's no blessing required. Now, the Rav explains, Kisheba lafrish menu tumat maaser u'maaser sheni, yachol lafrish v'orum delo bruche, when you come to separate the maaser sheni and the truma maaser from this Demai, you can separate without making a blessing, because if you would have to make a blessing, for example, by regular vadai, when you have teven, produce grown in Israel that wasn't separated for sure, you're not allowed to separate when you're naked. Why? Because you be required to make a blessing. And the Torah says, Vayamar chanecha kadosh, you're not allowed to bless when your heart can see your private area. You have to be covered. So since you can't bless, you wouldn't be allowed to separate. However, by Demai, since you don't make a blessing on it, because it's only a doubt, you're allowed to separate it even without clothing on, because you're not violating anything. You don't have to make any blessing over it. And again, like we said, Rabotai, the Mefarshim explain the reason you make no blessing on separating Demai is because, again, it's only stringency. Most Anaratza do separate their produce. So the Chachamim lowered it even lower than a regular standard rabbinic institution, like we have a Megillat Esther coming up. It's a bracha made by the rabbis, Chanukah, Nerut Chanukah. This is on an even lower level, therefore it has no blessing. The Mishnah continues, Ben Hashmashot, you're allowed to separate it Friday evening after sunset, but before 3 stars come out, what we call twilight. We have a safek, Shabbat begin or not. You wouldn't be allowed to separate vadai to tevet. Let's say a person has produce that for sure he didn't separate the maasrot from it. You're not allowed to do that on Ben Hashmashot, because that would be an issue similar to mitaken menah. You are finishing off a utensil. You're taking food that by separating, you're causing it effectively to about to be eaten. That's a sur. But again, since the Demai is only a safek, most Amei Aratzot are conscious to separate. Since it's only a rabbinical stringency, Chachamim say, we're not going to treat it so strictly. We are going to allow you to separate the Demai on Shabbat, even during this Ben Hashmashot, during this Ben Hashmashot period, which safek could be Shabbat. But Tevel or Demai you cannot do actually on Shabbat, and Tevel you cannot even do it during Ben Hashmashot. Only during Ben Hashmashot you can separate Demai, because since it's Safek, maybe Shabbat, maybe not, and anyways most Amerot to separate, Chachamim more lenient to allow you to separate it. Now, Rabotai, to conclude the Mishnah, we have to just explain again what we have in Halakha, and we spoke about previously. The Torah has two concepts on the 4th and 7th year of Pesach. Primarily, we're going to speak about what we call Vidui Maaser. On the last day of Pesach, on the 4th and 7th year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, the owner of such produce that was grown in Israel has to make a declaration saying, over the last 3 years, he separated the required portions, and you followed the procedure to separate the portions from the produce, and you dealt with them like the Alayev requires. This is a verse is brought down in Masechet Dvarim. This is what we call Vidui Maaser. Now we know you're now to separate Tumot and Masrot out of order. The Torah tells us, we learn out, the Rav brings down, we learn out in Sefer Shemot, they are now to separate Tumot and Masrot out of order. You have to follow 2% to the Kohen, then the 10% to the Levi. Levi gives 10% to the Kohen, then the 10% on the 1st, 2nd, and 4th and 5th year to Eden Yerushalayim, on the 3rd and 6th year for the poor people. You're not allowed to separate Tumot and Masrot out of order. One who separated actual Tevel out of order is now to recite this confession. The actual order, Rabotai, the Mishnah will speak about later, is Bikurim, the first fruits that are brought, then Tirumah, then Maaser Rishon, then Maaser Sheni. If you went out of order, you're now to recite this confession. However, Im Igdim Maaser Sheni Rishon, if you designated Maaser Sheni of Demai before the Maaser Rishon, meaning you took out 10% in Yerushalayim before you took out the 10% that's supposed to go to the Levi, there's no problem in this case. You're allowed to recite the confession. The Rav explains, Shiflish Maaser Sheni al Shedamai Kodem Shivish Maaser Rishon, Kidei Litul Tumat Maaser Shebo, and Bekach Klum, there's no problem. Mash'enkin Bevadai, which is not the case by Vadai Tevel, did not went into the Mishnah, Kechol Mitzvatcha Shetzivitani, like all the commandments I commanded you, Hai Migdim Maaser Sheni Rishon, if you would skip order and separate second Maaser before first, you wouldn't be allowed to confess. The Mishnah concludes now with two cases. One is talking about the laws, one is subject to the laws of the mind, one isn't. Shemen shagardi sachbetz beotav. Gardi, the Rav says, is an oreg, it's a weaver. Oil that the weaver smears on his fingers to protect them while he works. He uses the oil to protect his fingers similar to how you smear oil on your body. So we know there's a general principle we said earlier, sicha kishtiyah, when you smear it's like you drink. The question is, do we consider, the Mishnah's telling us, we consider rubbing it on your fingers for protection, like rubbing it on your body, that's considered like drinking. Therefore, the oil that the weaver smears on his fingers to protect them is obligated in Demai, just like by when you put on your body. But that which the comber puts into the wool to make it easier to comb, that's exempt from Demai, and the Rav explains to us exactly what the procedure was. After you wash raw wool, you comb it, you beat it with a stick to untangle it, and you prepare it for spinning. This is comparable, the Rav says, to how we start off the Mishnah. Oil that you use to grease utensils, that's exempt from Demai. Here it's also exempt from Demai. The reason that the weaver who uses oil for his fingers is Chayav in Demai, that's similar to rubbing it on your body. Therefore, since it's for your body, we learned previously in the Mishnah, that's considered like drinking. That you would have to separate Demai on. That is the end of Perek Aleph, Mishnah Daled. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.